Welcome to the Libertarian Institute Odyssey and YouTube channel. I'm joined by my assistant editor, Connor Freeman, and the Justin Ramondo fellow, Patrick McFarland. We are going to go through 3 stories each that we have seen in the media recently. Connor, start us off with an article you wrote, Forever War at the End of the World.
Yeah, absolutely. So I put this one out today. It's all about essentially how even as President Biden, the commander in chief admits that his proxy war in Ukraine has brought humanity to the brink of nuclear war, closer to nuclear Armageddon, as he said, than any time since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Even as he admits that, his Pentagon is planning on launching yet another endless war in Ukraine. So there was recently an announcement that the Pentagon is establishing a separate official command called Security Assistance Group Ukraine, and it'll be based in Germany and led by a high-ranking general with a staff of 300 people. And this is going to be overseeing the training and assist program, which they're saying is going to be modeled off of what they did in the Afghanistan and Iraq wars. So I make the point that even though the public has rejected the last 2 decades of endless wars, obviously our government is not. And now they're looking for long-term conflicts with Russia and potentially China as well, with respect to Taiwan. And so we just see constant streams of rhetoric from the Pentagon when they announced these. It came along with another $400 million arms package, which includes dozens of tanks, that they're in this for the long haul. They're going to do this for as long as it takes. And of course, it's important to note that Zelensky, for the longest time now, has been saying that he's ruling out peace talks or negotiations unless there is regime change in Moscow. And his government's their forces' attacks inside Russia proper, terrorist attacks including the assassination of the journalist and political scientist Daria Dugina, the bombing of the Kerch Bridge, attacks which Putin had referenced, attacks on actually nuclear power plants, not just in Zaporizhia, but also inside inside Russia proper. These separate attacks and more shelling after they took Kharkiv, over the border, led to these large-scale attacks on civilian infrastructure throughout the country of Ukraine for the first time. These strategic bombing attacks, which America usually does immediately when they start a war, as we saw in the Gulf War, for instance, or what the Saudis did in Yemen. But now Putin is actually doing is launching a similar campaign, and basically now there's an opportunity. Now that Russia has pulled back from the capital of the region of Kherson in southern Ukraine and some areas on the west bank of the Dnieper River, now there seems to be an opportunity, at least according to Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Mark Milley, and these unnamed Western and American officials who have been speaking to the media lately. And they're saying that now there's an opportunity. So I go through all the different protests that are going on throughout Europe against inflation and the proxy war and the sanctions and just the skyrocketing cost of energy and all the costs of living that are just soaring right now. And I'm saying how right now is the time for the American people to do the same and to insist that our government stop supplying weapons to Ukraine and insist on a negotiated settlement. And if they're capable of it, helping to broker a negotiated settlement.
Terrific work there. Patrick, what is the U.S. Nuclear Forces chief saying? The big one is coming.
Yeah, this was a really interesting piece, which I think highlights the thinking in the foreign policy establishment in the United States that Ukraine is just the warm-up, guys. So I've written pieces at the Institute talking about Uncle Sam's Grand Delusion was a piece that I wrote, how the general overall plan is that somehow we're going to put a pin in the Ukraine situation. Somehow we're going to bottle it up and turn to what the real challenge is. And that real challenge is China. And so we have the Stratcom commander putting out a statement saying his name is Charles A. Richard. He's a Navy admiral, talking about how the big nuclear threat is coming. And he said, the big one is coming, and it isn't going to be very long before we're going to get tested in ways that we haven't been tested in a long time. So I think of course, this is in the context of China, and China being the threat. The national defense strategy is clearly delineating that, and how Russia is a minor threat downgraded from China, but at the same time, they think somehow they can put a pin in the Russia situation and turn to China. And one of the reasons why I think that's a grand delusion is because they've blown their entire wad on the Russian situation. I mean, all of our weapons stockpiles are low. Our strategic oil reserves are low. We're committing economic suicide by prolonging this war in Ukraine and making sure that it goes on longer and longer. But the goal is China, and that's the next one. And we see with the Taiwan Policy Act that's been proposed, along with a couple $1 billion of military assistance to Taiwan and some assorted more spending, more billions of dollars to Taiwan. And another piece that I wrote in the Libertarian Institute talking about how Lindsey Graham is behind this plan, both in Ukraine and and Bob Menendez, both in Ukraine and in Taiwan, to basically make Taiwan the next Ukraine. So I think that this admission from Stratcom, just everyone in the libertarian movement should know that China is the next big thing, and they're looking to move on to that after Ukraine.
Good
if
catch,
we get
Brian.
out of it. Sorry.
Yep. Well, where can people find that national defense strategy?
You can just Google NDS. There was one that was put out in 2022, and it all really started in 2018.
Got it. Links to that will be in the description below. Here is one that came from a great book that I read called Don't Be a Feminist by Brian Kaplan. He says, look, there's a number of things that the feminist platform is overlooking. Number one, men are overrepresented at the bottom levels of society. They do most of the nasty, dangerous work, are much more likely to be homeless or imprisoned, and much more likely to kill themselves. Also, men spend much more time on the job than women. The law heavily favors women in child custody and child support disputes. Men are more likely to be victims of violent crime. Men are much more likely to die in combat. In fact, during serious military conflicts, they face military slavery, the draft. Finally, women often view men as success objects. Now, as one who absolutely hates the culture wars, all I am saying with promoting something like this that I think is so vital is that it's not just this one-sided fight that we're going, and it's not men versus women. What a false dilemma, or black versus white, or America versus Russia. The only thing that matters is, are people engaged with each other and treating each other with respect and dignity? In other words, allowing people to voluntarily disassociate. This is the principle of civilization, which conservatives need to embrace since they're the civilized ones. It's the principle of treating people equally with dignity. This is why progressives should embrace libertarianism as well. I think the feminist narrative completely overlooks it. It's a common scam, just as they will say the damn terrorists, what they do is they use violence against people, not mentioning that, well, the US government has done the same thing. So by that very metric and that standard, we could oppose both organizations. I don't support men's rights activism. I don't support feminism. The Libertarian Institute is about promoting freedom on all fronts. Next story we have is from Connor, analyzing a Michael Tracy article. Connor, what do you have?
Yeah, so Michael Tracy wrote this piece for his Substack back in the beginning of August, and I think it's especially relevant now, as you know, now that this week Donald Trump has announced that he's going to be running for president again. So this is all about a think tank in DC called the America First Policy Institute. It's cynically named because this thing is, I mean, essentially these are neoconservatives. The vice chairman of this group is Fred Fleitz, Bill Kristol's man, John Bolton's longtime chief of staff, both when he was national security advisor under Trump and when he was in the State Department under George W. Bush. So, you know, and also Lindsey Graham was at this event. This was an invite-only thing that Tracy went to cover, but Lindsey Graham was there. Newt Gingrich was cheering on and getting applause for praising Nancy Pelosi's provocative trip to Taiwan, which obviously raised tensions with China to unprecedented levels. And now, you know, he talks about how Michael Waltz is there, who's this Republican congressman from Florida, who had just gone to Kiev and talked about how he was calling for overt military advisor deployments to Ukraine. And in here, he says that we need to go in for the kill. And Tracy really grills him about this. Joni Ernst is there, another Republican, who's saying we need to beat the Russians so bloody they crawl back, bruised. And I forget how she phrased it, but bloody and bruised, on their knees, crawling back to Moscow because they can't walk. And so they're all calling for escalating the war, saying that Biden is not escalating enough. And so it's very important for people to go back and look at this. They're also very hawkish on China, of course. Lindsey Graham says that we need to double down in Ukraine as a show of force to reassure Taiwan that we have their back and that we'll support them in a similar way. This is really interesting because, again, he pushes Lindsey Graham to talk about the term America First. I believe that's Graham. I haven't read this in a while, but I recommend everybody go back. And Graham gets into an argument with him about how we're not non-interventionists. We're not isolationists. No. So, of course, they're just completely corrupting this term in the same way that Trump did, throughout his administration, really just giving Israel a blank check and escalating the bombing campaigns in Afghanistan, Somalia, and Yemen, aiding the genocide in Yemen all throughout his administration, that escalated new Cold Wars with Russia and China to unprecedented levels and setting the stage for the brinksmanship we have now under Biden, which, could have easily been predicted. But anyway, I recommend people go back and look at this one because it gives you a window. I believe Gingrich has some quotes in here about how they're looking at this America First Policy Institute as they said it'll be to what the Heritage Foundation was for the first Reagan administration. This will be for the second Trump administration. In other words, they're cooking up this policy almost like PNAC did for George W. Bush, and they've got all their people together. They're picking who's going to take what position, and they're saying that this guy Michael Waltz, who wants to really, we already have CIA and special operators on the ground, but that wasn't known at this time when this piece came out. But they talk about how this guy is going to be their man in the House of Representatives, their guiding light on foreign policy. So, this is foreshadowing of things to come, that these, the rebranded America Firsters, particularly the Trump-aligned factions, are going to be potentially just as hawkish, if not more hawkish, than the Democrats.
Patrick, I'm just having a little trouble finding it here, an article titled "Fact Check: Iran has not sentenced 15,000 protesters to death." What's going on here?
Yeah, so this is my next two news stories are going to be fake news stories that have really promulgated in the media just in this week. So there was a news story that was going around called just basically claiming that Iran has sentenced 15,000 protesters to death. And this was over the recent unrest in Iran based off of the killing of an Iranian woman who was allegedly violating the headscarf rules that exist in Iran. And so, of course, we're libertarians. We don't support any kind of, restrictive laws like that. But this is a situation where Iranian unrest is often weaponized by the United States as a regime change tool. And this story was picked up, 15,000 protesters sentenced to death. Apparently, there was a decree. This is the original story that turned out to be false. There was a signed statement and decree from 222 members of the 290-seat parliament of Iran calling for the judiciary to issue death sentences for 15,000 people arrested during the ongoing protests. So that turns out to be false. Of course, it's the Iranian judiciary and not the parliament that is responsible for sentencing people. But moreover, there isn't even this 15,000 number is a number that is linked to a basically an Israeli sock puppet, Iran International. Dave DeCamp covered this in Anti-War News, his podcast, how Iran International is fed headlines by the Israeli government, who, of course, we know the Israeli government has long had it out for Iran, often conducts assassination missions inside of Iran. And that's just really the tip of the iceberg for what they do with their covert actions in Iran. So not only is the sentencing to death part fake, that never happened, but we don't even know if there's 15,000 protesters that have been arrested. So this is just this news story. I would urge everyone to read this news story, but it's just all garbage from beginning to end. And this news story connects certain the National Endowment for Democracy to certain sources of this kind of media disinformation.
My next story, I decided to blog this after hearing about the wonders of attending college by a Democratic Socialist, Ben Burgess, not realizing that his passionate advocacy for people going to college completely violates their principle of $15 an hour minimum wage. In summary, college is 4 years of labor for $0 an hour. Thousands of hours of work for $0. How could something be justified? Well, you can justify it based on the principle of if an individual decides that is the best route for them to take, regardless of whatever the income is, maybe they want some skills, maybe they want some experience. All of that applies to the private, voluntary, commercial sector, to which the Democratic Socialists might say, well, these organizations are profit seeking, as Nancy Pelosi once said to Jan Helfeld, as if schools are just places where teachers don't get paid, custodians don't get paid, the buildings fall out of the sky, you don't have to pay construction workers. No, the teachers profit, the administrators profit, the people who sell the textbooks to the schools profit. Anytime people engage in actions, they're doing so because they think that changing their current circumstance will increase their overall well being. Burgess and the like are not doing anyone favors when they try to push anyone into college. This leads to what Brian Kaplan introduced me to as credential inflation, also known as academic inflation, is the process of inflating the minimal credentials necessary for a particular job while at the same time devaluing certificates and degrees. An individual with a printing press prospers, but a society can't get rich simply by printing more money. The same goes for credentials. So if the Democratic Socialists keep pushing everyone needs to get into college, teachers will have to lower their standards. So we will have worse everything. We'll have worse engineers, we'll have worse pilots, we'll have worse technology, and we will have a dumber population, all because the Democratic Socialist imperialists don't like people to choose things on a voluntary basis. They often enjoy coercing them. Next story we have is from Connor. I'm not sure where I got this. I believe it was a Caitlin Johnstone article.
Yeah.
What's up with her?
Yeah, so I can put it in the chat if you don't have it. But so this is all about this piece that just came out in the New York Times called Western Allies Look to Ukraine as a Testing Ground for Weapons. And so she did a terrific write-up about it. People can read the article themselves if they want, but some of the quotes she has in here that people will be interested in is Ukraine has become a testing ground for state-of-the-art weapons and information systems and new ways to use them that Western political officials and military commanders predict could shape warfare for generations to come. And this is from New York Times' Lara Jakes. She writes, new advances in technology and training in Ukraine are being closely monitored for the ways they are changing the face of the fight. And they talk about this new information system they have called Delta, which they claim was instrumental in retaking Kherson. By the way, Russia still controls 70% of that region. They withdrew from the capital. And as I said, these areas on the west bank of the Dnieper. But regardless, they're talking about how we've got these remote controlled boats, and we have used them to attack Russian ships in the Black Sea. And they talk about these anti-drone weapons they have and their air defense systems that even Germany is sending that include upgrades that even the Germans haven't used yet. And so they're testing all these different systems. There's a former Lithuanian president who's quoted saying, "We're learning in Ukraine how to fight, and we're learning how to use our NATO equipment. It is shameful for me because Ukrainians are paying with their lives for these exercises for us." And Caitlin goes, "Yeah, no shit." And so, I mean, really, there's also a quote here from, of course, the vice prime minister of Ukraine, who is saying that in the future, these wars are going to be heavier on drones. There's going to be and minimal humans, basically. And I mean, she discusses, of course, the Admiral Charles Richards quote about how we're looking toward the big one here, which is, of course, going to involve China, if not a hot war with Russia. And so what we're really doing here, and it just shows the depravity of the hawks and the empire and the military industrial complex and these NATO states, is that they really are. They don't care how many Ukrainians die, how many Russians die. As the leader of Stratcom said, this is just the warm up. And so they are really rubbing their hands together, and as she says, using these people as just the way you would use lab rats or guinea pigs in an experiment. I mean, hell, that's what the former Lithuanian president was saying. We're using them in these exercises. So yeah, just a window into the mentality of these people who claim that they're fighting for democracy and freedom, and because it's all about the liberal world order, and how we were just offended because, I mean, we would never allow another country to invade its neighbor and take its resources and all this. It's just beyond the pale for the American empire. So,
Patrick, responsible stagecraft. What's going on at the Associated Press?
Yeah, so Connor Eccles is someone he's a reporter over at Responsible Statecraft, and he's been producing a lot of really good work. And he had this piece out, which is a great piece that they ran at antiwar.com, really detailing what the reaction was to this news from, I believe it was Monday or Tuesday, where this rocket, what turns out is probably a Ukrainian rocket, landed in a small village very near the Poland-Ukraine border. And of course, there was a international firestorm that was kicked off over this. Many calls from people in Eastern Europe, in the Ukrainian media and Ukrainian officials, calling for NATO to invoke Article 5, which would constitute, would make all the NATO nations have to react to an attack on one NATO member, because Poland is a member of NATO. Now, of course, there's some nuance to that about exactly what the process would be and how NATO members would have to, the legal hoops they would have to jump through to actually respond to an Article 5 event. But anyways, it really is reminiscent of the story I covered earlier about the 15,000 prisoners in Iran, the alleged execution decree. But in this one, it really, Connor really goes through and details exactly who was saying what and which people were calling for the United States and NATO to get involved and being very brash about it. We had Jack Posobiec put out a statement yesterday saying that the attack had to be repaid in blood, this Russian attack, when none of the facts on the ground were ascertained to any degree of certainty. And furthermore, people like the Ukrainian foreign minister, Dmytro Kuleba, saying that, quote, Moscow promotes a conspiracy theory that it was allegedly a missile of Ukrainian air defense that hit Poland. No one should buy Russian propaganda or amplify its message. Then Zelensky tweeting that, quote, the Russian attack on collective security in the Euro-Atlantic is a significant escalation. But it's very lucky the Biden administration actually didn't take the bait, and maybe they deserve a little bit of praise for that, although we know what a train wreck the Biden administration has been, advancing and prolonging this war and escalating it. But I think who really knows how close we came to an actual World War III type scenario? I don't think it was actually super close, because there was an evaluation of the evidence and cooler heads prevailed. But this is just very emblematic of the danger that this conflict has presented since it began, and the possibility of an accident or a miscalculation, or people hysterically jumping to conclusions about something when none of the facts on the ground have been settled. It's just signals exactly how dangerous this conflict is. And maybe we dodged a bullet. Who knows how close we came.
For my final article, I have terrific news to share. I got this email yesterday. I am Alicia al-Gaddafi, the only biological daughter of former President Colonel Muammar Gaddafi. I'm a single mother, widow of 3. I have investment funds worth $27.5 million, and I need a trusted investment manager / partner. So, I mean, this is just terrific. I really think I'm going to start calling the shots more than the Koch brothers are nowadays. My question would be to someone, what would you actually think of me if I believed that email was legitimate and I believed I was about to be a millionaire? You would have basically no trust in anything I said. Not because you know Gaddafi's family or you know anything about investments, but what you know about psychology and incentives and how people value money and why she would trust a total stranger is just so unrealistic. It's not even worth looking into. So, this is my intellectual justification to completely embrace this idea of whatever it is, we're against it. It might sound like we're just being stupid and intellectually lazy, but we have faced so many scams with governments claiming to have a solution that it's the equivalent of falling for one of these Nigerian email scams at this point. When it comes to terrorism, of course, 9/11 was provoked because of sanctions, support for Israel, and bases in Saudi Arabia. COVID-19, of course, there was no correlation between lockdowns and good numbers. The idea that government education will make everyone brilliant, of course, was another scam. Poverty, government has spent trillions of dollars every year since the 60s with no benefits in sight. The best graph to show the scam of government is price changes January 2000 to December 2021. The greatest increases in prices have been in hospitals, schooling, and housing, the three things government gets involved in the most, the things they regulate and they subsidize. There's less competition, less choice, and less innovation as a causal result. So, this, I believe, is the analogy that I could use to people. You know what? I'm already against the next war. I don't know. I'm not going to read the Green New Deal. I'm against it. Just as you don't have to read every single thing in my spam box to know, well, maybe this investment isn't a good one after all. We know because of the way humans work that if these were such great ideas, we'd be able to voluntarily disassociate with the people promoting them. Thanks so much to everyone watching the Libertarian Institute, Odyssey, and YouTube channel. Links to these will be in the description below. Gentlemen, Patrick and Connor, thanks so much for your time, fellas.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks.
Looking forward to doing it again soon.